Hello and welcome. This is Rasheem with the Counter Narrative. Tonight's segment is BlackAdemics. We are speaking with the lovely Tamara Stevenson. Hello and welcome. This is Rasheem with the Counter Narrative. Sorry. I had my replay going in the background.
Okay, good. Thought it was on my end.
There's not two of me. We're speaking with the lovely Tamara Stevenson, who is an assistant professor of communications at Westminster College. We're going to be talking about all things BlackAdemic. We're going to talk a bit about racial battle fatigue. We're going to talk about educational inclusion and exclusion. We're going to talk about microaggressions, critical race theory, HBCUs. So if you are with that, then stay tuned. We're going to share all of that information with you. She has a lot of good information to share. At the end, we're also going to give you an opportunity to have a way to get in contact with her if you want to follow her, tweet her, repost some of her stuff, or just get more information on some of her research and what she's up to these days. If you are currently tuned in and you are watching live, feel free to go over to the chat section to my right, and I don't know which one is my right from you, but over here it looks like it for me. Go ahead and ask a question and we will answer your question live and online. If you are right now watching a replay, then still feel free to put something in the comments. Share this with someone else. One of the things about education and information that I love about social media is it has literally leveled the playing field where we don't have to keep information to ourselves, so we can share it with others, and we can also make sure that we stay connected by subscribing to this channel, The Counter Narrative. So I've mentioned Tamara Stevens a bit, but I'm going to swing it over to her and let her tell you a little bit about herself. So how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited about our conversation tonight.
Yay. I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're able to do this. I really do appreciate it. So one of the things I want to ask you first, starting off, is what is your interest in this topic?
The topic of between critical race theory, racial battle fatigue, racial microaggressions, what I'm so appreciative about is prior to coming into this knowledge is I knew those things were happening, but I didn't have the vocabulary to articulate them. It wasn't until graduate school when I encountered critical race theory, and it was a breath of fresh air for me. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan, and now I live in a state that I call a white-topia, and that's an actual term. So I'm not just making that up, but the idea of being able to have language to articulate my things that I was feeling, things that my body was experiencing due to the constant exposure to racism, racial discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping, just began to be more clear and be able to articulate what those things mean from learning about racial microaggressions, critical race theory, and racial battle fatigue. I was going there to talk about kind of this constant pattern of exclusion by inclusion, if you will. And I know we'll unpack that a bit more as we go along in our conversation tonight. But again, what was most intriguing to me was to be able to think about how people experience schools, people experience life in these exclusionary ways, not by their own doing, but by the policies and practices instituted by our government and by institutions, which are microcosms of the general society. So hopefully that was kind of a useful start to get us going.
Yeah, no, that was really good. So with that, I'd like to know, I mean, I think you kind of hit on it too. I'd like to know more about tell us something that you're passionate about.
I'm definitely passionate about, particularly for Black folk, for Black students in particular, that they understand how this system works so they can work it to their advantage. That's what other groups do. And I think for Black folks in particular, there's this range of just complete apathy by experiences from people that have come before us who just, you know, kind of live in this state of hopelessness. And then there are those who think, well, you're just excellent. You know, excellence rules. Black excellence is wonderful. We are Black magic, but yet there are barriers, institutional barriers that seek not only to hinder, but to completely block any advancement. And we've seen patterns of that. We've seen where some of us we're experiencing the fallout from those very laws that were put in place for that prevention, for those blockages in education and employment and housing, so on and so forth. And that's kind of what critical race theory speaks to, this interdisciplinary framework that looks at how ingrained patterns of racial exclusion occurred through laws set. Laws are being dismantled by our current administration, even as we speak. And so these are things we need to understand how they happen so we can begin to address them, navigate around them, navigate through them even.
Absolutely. You know, you said something earlier that I really feel like is so key, and I hope people don't miss it. And I feel like it also gives way to the significance of having this conversation. And what you did is you talked a bit about how there's these things that we're experiencing that we know that are going on, but may not have the language, the lexicon, the toolbox to really clearly articulate it. And to me, that speaks a lot to significance of language and understanding that language is an actual currency in communication.
Absolutely.
Rooms and everything that you get into. So with that, I would like you to empower the listeners with some of that terminology. And let's just start with, so the ones that I want you to define for us, but we're going to start with, and then we'll go back to the top. So racial battle fatigue, let's define and unpack that. Microaggressions, if we could define and unpack that. Critical race theory, if we could define and unpack that, as well as white-topia or white utopia. We have definitely got to unpack that one. And don't feel like you have to rush through any of these. So let's start with racial battle fatigue. And you know what, for everyone who's listening, if you are new to any of this language or any of this, I would suggest you get out a sheet of paper and a pen, and let's just go to school on this thing. You know what I mean? Tamara went to school, and I'm sure she spent a lot of money on her expensive degree that she has, and she is over here giving you knowledge, and she ain't charging you what.
The wealth share the love, share the power. Information is power.
Right. You're not getting charged of tuition here, so I would suggest you take advantage of that. So Tamara, let's start with racial battle fatigue.
Racial battle fatigue is the psychological, physiological, and emotional / behavioral response to distressing mental and emotional conditions that result from facing racism on a daily basis. I have to give a shout out to my mentor, Dr. William Smith, who is at the University of Utah, who actually coined this phrase and this phenomenon. His background is in psychology. And he likened racial battle fatigue to military fatigue that soldiers face in the field, that they experience that constant exposure to being in battle, have these psychological, physiological, and behavioral responses. And so it is with the constant exposure to racism, discrimination, prejudices that folks of color, Black folks in particular, face on a constant basis. So the psychological examples of racial battle fatigue can range from anxiety. It can include being irritable. It can include being just a mental fatigue, if you will, just hard times to think, even to get clarity on how to think well. Physiological responses could be higher blood pressure. We already know about health disparities for African Americans. from headaches, right? And you might be experiencing these things and might not know why. So you could go to the doctor and get everything checked out and you're still having these headaches. Well, there's a possibility that that your body and your mind are responding to that constant exposure to racism and racial microaggressions, which we'll define in a minute. And then those behavioral responses could be excess sleep or excess or insomnia. It could be all kinds of issues that prevent you from being able to function in society, right? And again, a lot of these can go unexplained, or they could be attributed to other things because we don't necessarily think about the impact of racism on our very bodies. And that's kind of how critical race theory articulates that. The basic tenet of critical race theory is that racism is an ordinary, mundane instance. It's become so ordinary and normal to us. Many instances we don't even realize it's happening unless we kind of have a big experience with it, right? But it's happening to us so often. Jane Elliott, the anti-racism educator, says we can't even escape racism. If we turn on our televisions, there's racism through the portrayals or lack of portrayals of people of color, of Black folks in particular. So if we're all good, I'll keep moving towards racial microaggressions.
Yes, yes.
Racial microaggressions are subtle, conscious, or unconscious, intentional or unintentional, layered, cumulative, verbal and nonverbal, behavioral and environmental insults directed at people of color based on race or other distinguishing characteristics that cause unnecessary stress upon people of color, but also benefiting whites.
So how does microaggressions benefit whites?
Because it definitely reestablishes or maintains the hierarchy, racialized hierarchy that works to the advantage of some and disadvantage of others in this country. Think about if somebody pokes you with a pin, you're distracted at the pain, and then those whites have an opportunity to advance or continue whatever they're doing. Again, it's these subtle ways to create distance or reduce the competition. Get rid of the competition if it's for a job, if it's for waiting in the line, right? Something so simple or subtle as it's waiting in line for something. If somebody says something to you, you're distracted from your goal. And now, go ahead.
Tell our audience, does something like a microaggression need to be intentional for it to be real?
Are you asking me that?
Say that again.
Are you asking me that about the intentionality? Yes. It's still there. It still has an impact.
You're saying yes to if it's not intentional, it's still a microaggression.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because again, this whole order of race and racism and discrimination and prejudice has been established in our social hierarchy. We learned this early. We learned this early in life. Dr. Smith also has a phrase called racial priming, in which racial hierarchy is established early on in life. Even if we're looking at how cartoons on television, the way that children are taught how to interact with other people if they don't have family members or people who are kind of aware. And so we learn these things early. Racism is learned. Nobody comes out of the womb automatically hating someone by the way they look. This is completely a learned behavior. And so whether it's intentional or not, it still has an impact.
So for a white person who might be listening and they're like, I don't think microaggression is real. I think it's something that Black people just make up to complain. Insulted all the time. What is a simplified way to explain to them what a everyday insult is and what a microaggression specifically is?
So I attended a conference last weekend, and it included white attendees. It was on multicultural education. And what I'm learning now, even though it's not my forte per se, meaning it's not my area of focus, because I think we need to continue to keep things real and honest about how institutionalized racism and systemic racism happens, is this point called empathy, right? How being able to see how someone else is experiencing something, sharing, understanding, and sharing the feelings of another. So if racial microaggressions doesn't ring a bell for whites, then maybe gendered microaggressions do. If it's something like, well, we just had our current president talking about grabbing the genitals of women. That's not only a microaggression, that's a macroaggression. That's a very direct assault, physical assault against a female.
Right.
Maybe it's environmental microaggression, where if you go somewhere regularly and you don't see anything or anybody that looks like you, you have been intentionally removed from that space. That can be considered a microaggression. There are microaggressions can also occur for someone's sexuality. It could also occur against someone's religion, right? Sometimes they're subtle. Of course, they're intentional or unintentional, definitely layered, but definitely a way to not just make someone feel bad, but certainly put them in their place.
Right. And I've heard some instances where even a person has thought that they were giving a compliment, like, you know, pretty for a dark-skinned girl, or wow, you speak, you speak good.
You're articulate. So articulate, and he's so clean.
And so sometimes that's why I asked some of the question I asked you around, does it have to have malice behind it? Because a lot of times when we talk about things in terms of racism and microaggressions, people will feel like because they have Black friends, because they don't own slaves, they don't want people to sit at the back of the bus, they're not overtly trying to demean another person based on race. So because of that, they kind of discount the possibility that they could be doing it unintentionally.
So, it's interesting. So my dissertation research dealt with racial microaggressions and racial battle fatigue. And one of the questions I had was, if you're asking about the intentionality of the sender, if you will, versus the recipient of the microaggression, is it a microaggression if the person doesn't see, if the person to whom it's directed sees it that way? So that's still the question I'm wrestling with. And so when you talk about kind of the backhanded compliments, if you will, and whether that's intentional or not, clearly some things are set out of ignorance, and yet it can still do the work of prioritizing or maintaining this hierarchy, racialized hierarchy that exists in our country. So to your point about if it's meant as a compliment, but it's still making it seem like if it's meant to demean the other person, such as you're pretty for a dark-skinned girl, you got a cute face, but your body might not match that, if you will. Again, I still think it has an impact.
Yeah.
And if the person doesn't see that, if that dark-skinned person, if you will, doesn't see that way, is it a microaggression? How about the person who hears it? That it's not even directed at them, but they hear it, right? It's still saying lighter is better.
Right. So tell us then about, so you've shared quite a bit in this little bit of time. So if people are listening, I hope you have your pen and your paper out. So because Tamara is taking us to school tonight. So you talked to us a bit about racial and battle fatigue and how that's the response to the constant exposure to racism, and a bit about microaggressions and how that can be received or sent directly or indirectly. Could you say more to us about critical race theory?
Sure. So critical race theory developed out of critical legal studies in the civil rights movement in the mid-1970s. A few names that come to mind that are definitely worth exploring are Derek Bell, who talks about interest convergence, and Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about intersectionality. And so even talking about racial microaggressions can be layered. So I'm a Black woman. I'm an African-American woman. So both race and gendered microaggressions kind of simultaneously coming together. It illustrates that layered aspect of that. There's an entire set of conversations I've had around that, defining, my Blackness and my womanness. And while some would just want to categorize me in one, I have to definitely say, no, there's both. And unfortunately, the law doesn't support that between Title VI and Title IX. Again, that's worth a whole conversation, but Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality theory definitely speaks to that. So those legal scholars back then looked at the work that came out of the civil rights movement, but yet had begun to notice that this retrenchment happening, that was possible to happen if those laws were being able to be rolled back. And in some instances, they have been. Affirmative action, for example, is one of those. And that's close to my heart, because I would not have been able to go to college without affirmative action. I call myself an affirmative action baby. I had 2 scholarships based on affirmative action to go to undergraduate school and to go towards my doctoral work. And I'm not ashamed of that. I was qualified. I had the grades for it. But again, because of systemic racism and barriers, and being from a working class neighborhood in Detroit, I needed the door open. Just open the door. Once I'm there, I can maintain, and I did, and I have. And so as we're looking at what critical race theory continues to unpack, there's a series of tenets that look at, again, the ordinariness of racism. It looks at interest convergence, which means whites will support laws and policies and practices that also benefit them. If it doesn't benefit them, then they won't support it. Counter storytelling is an amazing aspect of critical race theory, because if nothing else, it says, hey, somebody else has a different experience about that thing, and we need to hear about that too. It's not just one perspective on a thing. Lived experiences and telling those lived experiences is very important. And as critical race theory continues to develop, meaning it stretches into other areas as well based on race, such as Lacrit theory, critical race feminism, and it's just an evolving but really important and critical set of theories that help us unpack and explain the systemic and institutionalized barriers that people across various populations face on an intersectional level as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So if you are just tuning in, this is the Counter Narrative. Tonight's segment is BlackAdemics. We are talking with the lovely Tamara Stevenson, who is taking us to school at the moment. We mentioned a bit earlier about the significance of language and how having the language to articulate these experiences that we're having is so critical. And right now she is giving and sharing with us the currency of language. We have talked a bit about racial battle fatigue, microaggressions, and critical race theory. So if you didn't catch that and you're just tuning into this part, please make sure you go back to the beginning of the video, or you can subscribe to this if you can't watch it right now, and then you can come back and save your spot and watch it later. So now I want to ask you about white utopia.
So I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name. I want to say his first name is Rich, and it may be Benjamin, but he actually did, I know he wrote a book, and he has an NPR interview where he talked about, he visited various places. There's actually a city in Utah he visited, where he examined kind of how whites live in these spaces that we would consider not so much segregated, but clearly doesn't have a diverse population. And the state of Utah is definitely a whitopia as of today. The entire population, Black population in Utah, is at 1.1%. So again, me coming from a city that's easily 90% African American to come to an entire state that's 1.1% Black, and a big part of that population is due to the military base here in Utah. It's definitely been a culture shock. I've been here for about 5 years, and it's still a culture shock sometimes. And so I get a tickle calling it Whitopia, but that gentleman is clearly doing some interesting work and some interesting revelations about what it's like to live in a space that looks like you and supports you and affirms you in those ways.
Absolutely. So with that language, let's I'm really interested in talking more about too how all of these things are experienced in the academic environment and how they. Go ahead, I'll let you go.
Okay, so that was the basis of my dissertation. I was curious to know about how Black faculty, particularly Black two-year college faculty, exist in their faculty roles. Part of that was due to my work as a part-time adjunct professor. I got my master's degree in organizational communication, and it's like, well, just make a little money on the side. Let me try some adjunct teaching. And I really enjoyed it, but I was so surprised at the reactions I would get from white students. Again, I in the Metro Detroit area where I did some of that teaching, they never had a Black teacher before. And this was in the early 2000s. That's not that long ago. And you mean to say that you never encountered an African-American teacher in your K-12 schooling at all? I was the first one they had encountered in college. And so between that and the reactions that I would get from them, me having to continue to establish my legitimacy, my qualifications, being there in those classrooms, being challenged. And there's one thing to be inquisitive, to ask about the work, but to continue to ask me about, well, are you qualified to be here? Is that really true? If another professor who was probably white and male had said the same thing that I said, they wouldn't question it. And that just piqued my interest in some profound ways. And so I was really curious to study that for faculty at the two-year college, because as we understand, community colleges were organized and developed to expand access for populations who would not otherwise have gone to college at all. And so I'm so grateful to bring more attention to community colleges through my work, and talking to almost 20 Black male and female full-time community college professors was an amazing experience. I went to 6 institutions, and they all had some interesting lived experiences to talk about. Some of them actually integrated their colleges. And again, we're talking late 1980s. Again, not that long ago. Community colleges have been around since the beginning of the 20th century. And so for them to just integrate in the late 1980s just shows how exclusionary that faculty role and that faculty pipeline is for communities of color, particularly African-American faculty. So what else can I share about that?
What were some of your so you shared a bit about the students, their response to not having, first of all, not having a Black teacher is just like, wow.
Yeah.
But that also shows what type of access or opportunity has, been afforded to, or, not afforded to educators of color, you know what I mean, for them to go that entire time. But what has been, in your findings, the experiences of those teachers with other faculty?
Oh, that's interesting. So it ranged from just complete isolation, where they just weren't not able to into their environments. There's one instance where one of my research participants, when she would go to lunch in the student center, wherever their lunch was, and she would end up sitting by herself. When she would try to kind of engage with other faculty members, they were, you know, pretty just rather cold to her. And she had worked at that institution for several years. Another participant talked about he was kind of chastised about his dress. He dressed very well, but the other faculty members, again, the white faculty members, in his words he said they dressed like they were going to a farm. And he said one of them came to him and said, you know, you need to stop dressing up so much. You're making us look bad. And he's like, no, I was trained to look presentable. And, you know, they wanted him to kind of go down to their level. And of course, he didn't do that. Another faculty member talked about a handshake being questioned. He, as a Black male faculty member, he shook hands with another person, and someone asked him, "Is that a gang handshake?" And it's like, would that be asked of anybody else? Of course not. So yeah, those are some examples. It was amazing to talk to these faculty members because the stories they resonated with me, and again, to just hear the differences that they would experience that would not happen to any other faculty member, particularly the white faculty members. But it was a way to, again, kind of establish order, right? One thing, you have to be in this place, right? But let's be clear on what the order is. And just to note, according to the National Center of Education Statistics, as of fall 2013, that's the most recent data available, 43% of full-time faculty, and that's across institutional types, so public and private, 2-year, 4-year, 43% of faculty were white males, 35% white female. For Black males, 3%, for Black females, 3%. So we're seeing, again, there's a big gap. In the 21st century, there's still a huge gap between white faculty and faculty of color.
Wow. Yeah. One of the things that we talked about a bit earlier, kind of off camera and a little bit on camera actually, was the first institution and institutional barriers. So can you talk to us a little bit about the first institution? Who was education actually designed for? And yeah, let's just start there.
So whenever I get the chance, I love to ask audiences, what was the first college in the United States? What was the first college established in the United States? And they'll go through a couple of names, and eventually we'll land at Harvard College, now Harvard University. When? 1636. Who was that institution designed for? Well, we know in 1636 who it wasn't designed for, because the United States was still bringing in Africans from Africa and other parts of the diaspora to be free labor. And so who was Harvard targeted to educate? Usually those that were white, male, likely heterosexual, clearly wealthy, and who were going into some form of ministry or ministry, Christian ministry in particular. And so between evolving ideas, laws changing, eventually starting with women eventually entering higher education, it wasn't as if Harvard College opened their doors and said, all are welcome. What happened? Women's colleges were established. Trying to think of a couple of them that come to mind. But again, women's colleges were established, and then finally with the Emancipation Proclamation, and now you have all these Black folks walking around. They need to be educated. Did those women's colleges open their doors? No. Did Harvard College and the other Ivy League schools open their doors? No. They established what we now call historically Black colleges and universities, and that's where many Blacks were and continue to be educated in our country. So this thing about inclusion by exclusion is fascinating to me. And so to hear our new Secretary of Education refer to historically Black colleges and universities as pioneers of school choice just shows how very misinformed she is, and clearly has an agenda to enact school choice. She happens to be from Michigan, so I'm very aware of her. This is not a new message for her. She's steady on message. But to mislead folks who are hearing her that historically Black colleges and universities were a choice, it's wrong, and it's misleading, and it's destructive. And hopefully this will raise awareness about the powerful role that historically Black colleges and universities have had to educate African Americans in this country. They do need attention. They do need more money. And so we're watching this thing unfold. And so hopefully some good will come out of this, where these colleges will be able to sustain. Some of them have gone through some dire situations. Many have closed due to funding through the years. But clearly an important aspect of educating African Americans and all those who want to go there, right? Those are actually open to anyone. They don't turn people away if they're not Black. You can actually go to an HBCU if you're something other than Black.
Right. You know, so we're at a point now where we're talking about HBCUs and also talking about their doors closed. I went on a HBCU, I don't know, what's it called, spring break tour, I guess you could say. And we even went to Brown's campus, which was sad, maybe just like cry.
Yeah.
With knowing how HBCUs and why HBCUs were even put here in the first place, and now that we have so many other options, what do you say to the person who asks you about a little bit about the legacy, but what about the legitimacy? Like, do we even still need HBCUs, and why are they important?
So I didn't go to an HBCU. My reason that I didn't go is because I got a full scholarship to the school I did go to. And so I went where the money went, and it was also it was local. So I got to stay home when I went to school. So that helped me. That was what I needed at the time. But clearly, HBCUs are legitimate. They produce so many folks in STEM fields, engineering, preparing them for medical school. So you can get a very high quality education at an HBCU. Anecdotally speaking, friends and colleagues that I know who have attended HBCUs have such a stronger sense of identity. And because if you're attending what I call an historically white institution, I went to two of them, we're having to wrestle with racial microaggressions, racial battle fatigue. I now understand that. And that can take away from learning. That could take away from actually being able to concentrate. And so if you're in an environment where you're racially, that can only encourage you, and it gives you some energy to actually focus on your studies. And so if that environment can cultivate that, then that right there is already worth it. But you can get a high quality education at an HBCU. There are many across the country, mostly in the East and in the South and in the Midwest. But clearly their legitimacy remains. And again, with their elevated attention that they're getting between Betsy DeVos's comments, the HBCU president's meeting with Donald Trump this week or last week, again, this issue of funding, this issue of purpose and function, these are important questions we need to be exploring.
Absolutely. I mean, you've given us so much in this short period of time. We have tons of language for which to kind of understand racial battle fatigue, and particularly as it relates to higher education. So if you are just tuning in, again, this is the counter narrative. Tonight's topic is BlackAdemics, and we are speaking with Dr. Tamara Stevenson, who is an assistant professor of communication at Westminster College. And she is sharing with us quite a bit. So if everyone has been paying attention, what you've gotten so far, what you've learned is you've learned what racial battle fatigue is. You've learned about microaggressions. You've learned about critical race theory. You've learned about white utopia. You've learned about what was the first school. You've heard names like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw. I'm just going to throw out another one, Patricia Hill Collins.
Absolutely.
So you've heard some of those names and have some context. So and for some of you, that may have been enough, and that was great and fantastic. And for some of you, you're still hungry, you want to know more. I would say, not only would I encourage you to look up some of those names, look up some of these terms, but please do reach out to either me or Dr. Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson, tell everyone how they can get social and get connected with you if they want to connect and learn more.
Well, I'm glad to share my email address, and maybe we can figure out how to write it down. It's kind of long because the name is long. So it's tstevenson@westminstercollege.edu. And I don't really do social media that much. I'm actually ready to go on a social media break, especially post this presidential election, but we can start there with the email address. I'm glad to respond to questions, share information. I learn as well from questions, so please, I welcome them.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking your time to come on the show. This has been really great. I love having these conversations and love being in a situation where I feel like I can share information and learn at the same time. So I appreciate you.
Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for what you do. And I'm looking forward to listening more and watching more and following more. And again, learning is evolution. Learning and knowledge is power. So the more we can talk and inform, I'm all for that. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you. I got to have you back on again. So for everyone listening again, please feel free to subscribe by hitting the red and white button, because when you subscribe, it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. And you can also tweet me on Twitter and friend me on Facebook. I typically follow people back in a non-stalkerish sort of way. So I am on Facebook at either Just Call Me Rasheem or Rasheem. And I am on Twitter at @srasheem and on Snapchat at s.rasheem. And I am on my website at srasheem. So I'm srasheem pretty much everywhere. Thank you again for tuning in, and you guys have a good night.